Hi, my name's Willing Davidson. I'm an editor at The New Yorker, and this is Ben Taub, and he's a writer at The New Yorker. Lots of people are talking about the Golden Globes today. We're not going to do that. Instead, we're talking about Syria today, which is a topic that can be a little hard to focus on because the war has now been going on for almost 6 years. Half of that country has been displaced. Hundreds of thousands of people have been killed, and yet it goes on every day. So it's very hard to capture the texture of the Syrian war. So what we thought we'd do today was give people kind of a cheat sheet to the war and focus on sort of a few key elements of it and a few key times. We'd love to hear from you guys. If you have questions, please leave them in the comments below us, and we will try and answer them. So I thought we could start with the Syrian government's almost complete takeover of Aleppo, which is was the largest city in Syria, that has been the focus of tons of fighting between the rebels and Bashar al-Assad's government for years now. Finally, at the end of December, the government forces succeeded in taking over the city and evacuating a ton of civilians from it. How did they win the city of Aleppo? And probably more important, is this a turning point for the Syrian war? What does it mean going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. It is a crucial turning point for the war. It's a deeply demoralizing defeat for the rebels, and it's also a deeply demoralizing defeat for anyone who sort of believed in any concept of human rights basically mattering to the international community. We saw a lot of videos coming out of Aleppo in the final days, where activists who had stayed largely because they believed that documenting human rights violations, and they'd been told by Western governments, officials, press, etc., that documenting human rights violations mattered, and maybe by showing what's going on, they would receive some sort of help, or there would be punishment for systematic crimes. They were filming these final videos saying, like, as a final plea to other activists living in other repressive parts of the world, and effectively telling them, like, don't trust the UN, don't trust the international community. They won't be there for you when you need them. And in that sense, too, the UN is awfully close to complicity in some of what happened. If you take, for instance, Aleppo's real defeat.
What did happen?
Right. So Aleppo was eastern Aleppo, because the city's been divided in two for quite some time, basically since 2012. The rebels took over half the city, but not the whole thing. Mm-hmm. And actually, that's been a point of difficulty in coverage, is often people refer to, like, atrocities in Aleppo. But it's important to distinguish between the eastern side, where the rebels and many civilians were stuck, and the western side, where the government troops remained in control, and where a lot of civilians from the rebel side fled to, and where also a lot of civilians were suffering from rebel shelling, random shelling from the rebels. Right. So in July, the Syrian government trapped eastern Aleppo. They cut off Castillo Road, which is the main supply route from Turkey, where a lot of aid organizations used to deliver, food, medicine, etc., and where also, Islamist groups would funnel weapons through that route. They cut it off with help from the Russians, Russian air power, also Iranian militias, Hezbollah. Some of the Iranian-backed militias also include Afghan refugees who have been forced to fight. We also have Iraqi militias on the ground. And ever since eastern Aleppo has been surrounded, it's been sort of constricted further and further and further, and the population was suffering immeasurably. The hospitals were being attacked, the markets were being blown up, and they couldn't really get food or aid in. Nobody could. And so this went on for several months until in December, there was a vast military surge on the part of the government and Russian air power, and they They effectively took over a large number of neighborhoods in eastern Aleppo extremely fast. And at that point, it became clear that as the population of eastern Aleppo shrunk into a smaller and smaller area, crammed into a smaller and smaller area, they were afraid of being completely annihilated. And this was fueled in part by leaflets that were being dropped by the Russians and the Syrian governments from the aircraft that literally said, if you stay, you will be annihilated. The international community has completely forgotten about you and doesn't care what happens to you. And so they were being told to leave, but they weren't given anywhere to leave to. There was no avenue out. The only avenue out was to go into government-held areas where many of these people, quite reasonably, feared that they would be tortured or killed because, many of their relatives had been tortured and killed when from the beginning of the war. And so what then came about as attention really bore down on this area, international attention, press attention, outrage at the UN, and so forth, at least spoken outrage at the UN, the Russians and the Syrians brokered what became known as the evacuation of Aleppo. And that was a very carefully chosen term, because the word evacuation suggests voluntary displacement, and that there was some element of assurance of safety to those who wanted to stay, and that it was somehow some sort of natural disaster as opposed to just, us killing you. And so the UN went along with this term. They had a Security Council meeting where they stressed the safe and voluntary evacuation of these people. But in fact, what it was, quite clearly, was a forcible displacement by the definition outlined in the Rome Statute, which is the founding document of the International Criminal Court. And forced displacement is a crime against humanity when, committed against a civilian population in a widespread or systematic way.
And so where did these people go? Where are they now?
So some of them did go into government-held areas. There were reports of executions. There were also reports of disappearances among especially men and boys, military-age men and boys. But then there were also, people that were clearly used in they would go on state television and sort of be these props saying, look, like, we rescued you, aren't you grateful for the support and help of the government? And say, yes, like, thank you for saving our lives. But others went into Idlib province. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, please. Well, so they're in Idlib province. What does this do for the Syrian government? What's the next move for them?
Yeah, so the overwhelming majority, once the evacuation was really negotiated, they were put on these buses that were sent into Idlib province, which is sort of the last real bastion of what would be called rebel-held territory as opposed to ISIS territory or some other, or government territory. At this point, there's pretty much not much else in the country. And so they went into Idlib province. They were displaced. The Turkish-Syrian border is sealed, so most refugees can no longer get into Turkey. Idlib is basically trapped in northwest Syria. So now these people have been put into an area that, whereas the excuse for a lot of the illegal bombardment of Aleppo was that, this was we were attacking terrorist targets, and the terrorists have occupied and are holding civilians hostage in these areas. Aleppo actually had an extremely small presence, quite a large rebel presence, but an extremely small presence of people who had ever been affiliated with an al-Qaeda group at this time. Other years in the war, there was a lot of al-Qaeda presence. But Aleppo it wasn't really valid for Aleppo. It was kind of a lie, and it was a justification. In Idlib province, there is an al-Qaeda presence. And so now these people have been displaced into an area where they're surrounded by parts of it are sort of governed by Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, which is this al-Qaeda-linked group. It was formerly the official branch of al-Qaeda in Syria. So people are now, in some parts, having to, abide by their rules and their governance. And in other places, they're going to be, in 3 months from now, 4 months, 5 months, we're likely to see a similar kind of annihilation of a civilian population with the same kind of justifications. But this time, it's kind of true. Like, there will be al-Qaeda presence. Those bombs are easier to justify, and especially since they kind of got away with these mass atrocities the first time in Aleppo. So
having survived the siege of Aleppo for 4 or 5 years, they may be going to re-inhabit the same fate. That's very depressing.
It's very depressing, and there's a few tens of thousands of people that are facing that now.
So speaking of war crimes, in the spring and the summer, you wrote a couple also very depressing pieces, but very useful, informative pieces basically outlining how the Assad government had sort of used war crimes as an intentional strategy. And one of them, which seemed to be pretty novel to most observers, was attacking medical care. And I wondered if you could tell us a little about how that came about and the continuation of that strategy. And for those who have just joined us, we're talking about Syria, all the depressing new revelations. And if you guys have questions or comments, please put them in the comments below and we'll try and get to them. But so targeting medical care, sure. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so targeting of medical facilities and civilians in general is a war crime. And the way to prove it in the case of Syria is that these attacks have been so systematic, you can map out, and a group called Physicians for Human Rights has mapped out hundreds of attacks on medical facilities over the past five and a half years.
And they seem to be intentional.
Very deliberate, often targeting the same place multiple times, often with multiple bombs in the same attack. And these locations are known to the government because many of them in rebel-held territory were former government hospitals. Right. So they know where they are, and they know it's a hospital. This tactic of basically committing war crimes on a widespread, systematic level has been adopted with the knowledge that basically international criminal law is, to a disturbing extent, contingent on geopolitics. Its application is. And so while we have these list of rules of how wars must be conducted and that there will be consequences to people who violate this conduct, it's become clear in Syria in particular that if you don't have like a geopolitical mechanism to actually get to prosecution, then you can get away with anything. And so in the case of Syria, very briefly, Syria is not a signatory to the International Criminal Court, and neither is Russia or, for that matter, the United States. And so the only referral mechanism is through the UN Security Council. But if any country vetoes a measure to refer jurisdiction, then the measure it's over. So the Russians blocked a measure, so did the Chinese. But and the Russians can be expected to continue to block any proposals because now they're systematically committing war crimes as well. They'd effectively have to refer themselves to the International Criminal Court, which is never going to happen. Right. So as a consequence, we basically have a situation in which war crimes can be committed and are being adopted as a strategy. So medical facilities are being constantly attacked, and we're seeing that as this proliferates, other countries, take the Saudi assault in Yemen. Saudis have bombed a lot of medical facilities in Yemen, knowing they're medical facilities. Doctors Without Borders had to withdraw a lot of its foreign staff.
And that's presumably because they are making the calculation, no one's stopping it in Syria.
Yeah.
Why are they going to stop it in Yemen?
No one's stopping it in Syria. Why are they going to stop it in Yemen? And the Saudis have powerful friends on the UN Security Council as well. Right. So, yeah.
So we've talked about as you've been listening to us, you've heard the names of all these different groups, all these different countries. You have the Kurds, you have ISIS, you have various rebel groups, you have Russia, now you have Turkey in there. And one name we haven't discussed is the United States, which is ironic because when the Syrian civil war started, and as it reached a fever pitch in 2012, 2013, 2014, it seemed like the U.S. had a big role. Yeah. And we all remember President Obama issuing a red line saying to President Assad of Syria, if you use chemical weapons, we will be forced to take presumably military action. Assad went ahead and used chemical weapons. Obama stepped back. And it seemed like Obama and the United States sort of got scared off a little by the escalating chaos. They sort of started out seeing it as part of democracy promotion, part of the Arab Spring. When it descended into just a brutal civil war, the U.S. stepped back a little. Yeah. Without reducing this to, was this good or was this bad, was there ever a moment where the U.S. could have done something productive in Syria. They did plenty of things, but everything seemed to, they armed various rebel groups. Within 10 days, those arms were in the hands of ISIS.
Right.
Stuff like that.
Right.
Everything we seemed to do backfired. Yeah. Was there ever a time when we could have done something to de-escalate this war?
I think there was, but I think that it was unpalatable politically. It was a very specific time, and there was an extremely small window, which I'll get to in a second, but the reason I think it didn't happen is that it was politically unpalatable, and the public didn't know at the time what ISIS was and wouldn't have cared what ISIS was back then. So in 2013, I was living on the Turkish-Syrian border in a small town called Kilis, and I'd been there for several weeks. I'd watched a lot of a lot of journalists had been abducted crossing that border in the preceding months. I knew one of them, and journalists who were covering Syria were very, very, very on top of the fact that ISIS was forming and rising because they were kidnapping us. We were terrified of them. Right. As a result, we placed a lot of priority on this group, but I don't think many other people did. And there were stories written about the rise of ISIS from its inception and its founding announcement in April 2013, but it didn't really capture the public attention because it was just a thing in Syria. Few months later, in August, there was the chemical weapons attack and the question over whether or not we would intervene. And I don't have a real well-formed opinion on whether or not that would have been a good thing. One thing that I did just learn during the course of my reporting that I didn't know initially was that had we bombed certain key military sites, like Al-Meza Air Base, for instance, where a lot of Assad's air force was taking off from, we would have actually killed a lot of detainees because the Syrian government was keeping detainees in Meza Air Base and using them to stock the hangars and as basically as human shields. So we could have actually killed a lot of innocent people had we taken
action.
Yeah. So, but the key point that I think isn't really discussed and really isn't on the map of this question is about 3 weeks after the chemical attack. For months, we'd been half-heartedly supporting various rebel groups with arms, but not really enough. Not enough arms, not enough money, not enough support to actually do anything effective. And there was a really good reason for holding back, and that's that these rebels were, at the time, not collaborating with, but accommodating ISIS. Because ISIS was useful, because ISIS wasn't really killing them or harming them, and sometimes would help them break Assad's enemy lines. For instance, there was an air base, Medag Air Base was a few miles south of the border, right where I was, and I remember I watched the shelling on the final night of that battle from my window in Turkey. That siege was broken because ISIS sent a bunch of suicide car bombs that broke the walls that had, for months and months and months, the rebels hadn't been able to break. So they had this sort of tacit alliance. But in September 2013, right at that crossing in Azaz, the Syrian town, ISIS and the rebels started killing each other for the first time. And at the time, ISIS was a few thousand guys. They didn't really control any territory. They just kind of had men in a bunch of areas. They were stronger and better fighters than most of the rebels, but they really weren't the force we see today. They hadn't gathered the same degree of, tens of thousands of European and North African recruits. And I think that, and I remember arguing at the time in a college class that the U.S. needed to support the rebels against ISIS militarily with boots on the ground.
And when we say the rebels and ISIS, what exactly are we talking about? We have ISIS, we know, is the Islamic State that was trying to overthrow Assad, but it was also trying to set up its own theocratic Islamic government.
And that was the priority.
And that was the priority. You just had to get rid of Assad to do it.
Yeah.
But the rebels, it was hard to know who the rebels were, right? Because they were made up of a dozen different groups at least. Hundreds. Who all had their... So part of the U.S.'s reluctance, presumably, to arm the rebels was not which rebels,
Totally.
Do we go for the most effective rebels? Do we go for the ones who really love eating at McDonald's?
Right.
Do we,
Right.
which are the rebels who we can support?
It's a great and a very difficult question, and I think that is fundamentally the question that hampered our support. In this case, though, if we look at what we're doing now and have been doing for the past year or so, airstrikes on ISIS targets, we've been doing this since, I guess, 2014, and then later came, we have special forces in Syria who are training and equipping and supporting various militias against ISIS. Had we done exactly that in 2013, I think that it could have been extremely effective, extremely fast. Instead, we waited to a point where, now to recapture Raqqa, to capture Mosul,
Which are the strongholds of ISIS in Syria and Iraq.
Yeah, and ISIS has, they control cities, and they have determination over civilian populations. They're executing civilians who try to leave. At the time, they couldn't really do that because they were just a bunch of guys.
Right.
And by allowing that, we effectively, we didn't, I don't want to say we allowed them to grow, because we didn't, but we, inaction.
But
not
we
just
watched them.
We watched them grow, and it's not just the U.S., but inaction on the part of the international community at a point where ISIS really wasn't well known because it hadn't taken Mosul, hadn't beheaded any of the journalists that it had already kidnapped. I could imagine that. I've thought about this a lot. There must have been. I was in Kilis, and I sort of could see this just from being there, and I didn't really have great contacts or anything. I was just a guy who was living there and learning about the war. But I imagine that there must have been a fair number of agents from various Western intelligence agencies who were in the area, in Gaziantep, north of Kilis, or in Kilis itself, or in northern Syria, who saw the same thing and who probably wrote some very interesting dispatches back to Washington that got largely ignored.
Right.
Yeah.
So we're talking about Syria, and we thought we'd take some comments from the audience now. And one is a very good question, which is basically, what does Syrian civil society, what do people in Syria have to do, or how can they organize a positive transition post-Assad? So, of course, this assumes a couple things. It assumes that Assad will lose power, which 2 years ago seemed very likely. Now it seems less likely. And one of the reasons it seems less likely is that the international community, as a body, is basically terrified about what will come next. Yeah. They see the example of Libya. They even see the example of Egypt. Syria is, in 100 times worse shape. Destroyed by many more factions. So many people say, you know what, maybe Assad, we recognize all the terrible stuff he's done, maybe he is our best hope for stability. But should he end up being assassinated, taken out, should rebels end up winning the war, how could Syria sort of engineer a future for itself?
That's that is the question. I don't think anybody has a good answer. I certainly don't. What I could address is a few plausible steps. Right. I think it's extremely unlikely that Assad will fall, or at the least that the Syrian government will fall. You never know if there will be some sort of internal issue, coup, who knows. What I would say is that he's very successfully created a situation in which his fall is pretty much unpalatable, and in which the priority of stability is preferable to almost everyone in the international community to chaos and terrorism, which is exactly how he framed it from the beginning when it wasn't the case, and then has sort of made it the case, which was his strategy for survival from the outset. And in that sense,
he has made himself indispensable.
Absolutely, and in that sense, his conduct, in a very Machiavellian sense, has been a complete success. I think that something that is plausible for if there's ever to be any sort of peaceful resolution, which I think is, not approaching
Right.
will be he cannot be in power, and there may be some sort of plausible transition in which, and I think there's been discussion of this, though I don't want to assert too strongly that that this is going to happen, but there's been some discussion at geopolitical level between the Turks and the Russians and previously the U.S. That Assad could step down, Iran or Russia could give him safe asylum, and a sort of
caretaker government.
Yeah, caretaker government. And there's also talk of would Syria split into several states where, well, for one, you'd have basically ISIS has carved off its own portion, which would be everyone's problem, and it already is everyone's problem. Damascus, Assad, he controls the important parts of Syria already. In that sense, it's a huge success. He controls. There's this line from Aleppo, Hama, Homs, Damascus. These are the really important cities, and he controls those. And Raqqa's kind of out in the, it's in the desert. Hasaka is in the Kurdish area, but it's kind of cut off. He could have the Syrian government could control whatever it's made up of, something that looks like a state, even if it doesn't include all of Syria's sovereign territory.
Got it.
Yeah.
One more question. How long has Russia been aiding the regime? In other words, when the Syrian civil war started out, was Russia immediately on Syria's side? Are Assad and Putin longtime allies? And have they sort of stepped up their aid as the civil war has continued?
Yeah, so I think, and this is sort of opinion and analysis, but my sense is that basically Russia's, in the earliest stages, Russia's chief contribution, which was very successful and maybe thought to more important than it seemed at the time, was obstruction at the level of the Security Council to prevent war crimes investigation, prevent any international intervention. That's what they did that was really, 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 really helpful. Later, and Russia got involved militarily, and that was that was in September 2015. They started using their air force. They sent an aircraft carrier to the Mediterranean quite recently. They started, basically serving as Assad's air force, and in many ways assisted in intelligence gathering. And in Aleppo, quite recently, in the last month, there was a revelation, I believe, reported in the Wall Street Journal, that Russia had special forces on the ground, troops, not just air force.
Wow.
Yeah.
So Russia is actually perhaps fighting in Syria.
Russian special forces are fighting in Syria. Yeah.
And have there been Russian casualties? How does this play in Russia?
There have been a few Russian casualties. Not a huge number. Actually, some of the casualties have been by equipment malfunctions. I believe a couple of jets fell into the water after taking off from the aircraft carrier. They just missed.
An occupational hazard.
Yeah, it is. And then there have been a handful of fatalities at the hands of ISIS. I believe a Russian soldier or two killed in the battle for Palmyra. A couple of others have been captured by rebels. And I believe killed, but I don't know the specifics. In Russia, I think it's largely being played out as Russian media has been very, very. It's serving, as we've seen in our own election, as the arm of the Russian government, pushing through various narratives that tend to be, if true at all, very, very, very partially true, and then amplified in English-speaking voices to sort of push that everyone who's opposed to Assad is a terrorist, and Aleppo's displacement was a liberation, and all this kind of stuff.
Well, it sounds like a totally intractable situation.
Yep. That's one of the challenges for covering it and for discussing it has been, how do you continue to garner public interest and attention to something that's, first of all, always horrible. There's never any moment of positive outlook for this war, and for, you know, we don't even at the moment have a chance to look forward to the prosecutions of like the worst war criminals of the past 60 years. But second of all, because these atrocities happen systematically, and that means you report something detailed, and then the next week it happens in exactly the same way. Are you going to write the exact same story over and over and over and over and over? I mean, there's an exhaustion element to it.
Well, I think that gives you just a little taste of the many complexities of the Syrian war. If you want to read more, Ben has, in the past year, written 2 extremely good pieces. One in the spring called The Assad Files, which details how the Assad government sort of used war crimes strategically since the beginning of the war. And the second one was called The Shadow Doctors, and it's specifically and heartbreakingly about the Syrian government's attacks on the medical infrastructure of Syria. Thank you all for watching. Again, I'm Willing Davidson, and this is
I'm
Ben
Ben Taub.
Taub. Thank you.
Thank you.